Hi everyone, welcome to our first video in a series for beginning chess players. So what you are looking at right here is the starting position of a game of chess. Chess is played on a board of 64 squares in 8 rows and 8 columns. And it's a two-player game, and one player plays the white pieces, which you see at the bottom, and the other player plays the black pieces, which you see at the top. Now in this video, what we're going to accomplish is we will learn the different types of pieces and how they move. So if you take a look at the white pieces down here, you'll see a row of 8 pieces that all look the same, and those are called pawns. Now in the two corners here and here you see rooks. Next to those you'll see the knights, next to those the bishops, and then in the center there are the two royal pieces. This piece here with all the little spikes like this is a spiky crown, is the queen. And next to the queen is her king. And a king, if you look really closely, has a little cross on the top. Okay, so let's get used to each piece and how it moves. So I'll clear the board, and I want to start with a rook. A rook is a very simple piece to get used to. So there's a rook. It looks like a castle or part of a castle, like a tower, but it's not called a castle, it's called a rook. Now rooks move in a straight line, either horizontally or vertically, and they can go any number of squares. So this rook, for example, in one turn can move to the right over to here, that's a turn. Then maybe next it can move up here a few squares, and then maybe makes a little baby move to the left like that. And then it makes a big move down here. So it's always traveling in a straight line. Now, if there is a friendly piece on the board, like a pawn right there, that piece can block the movement of the rook. If this rook wants to move up, it can move up, but only to this square. It can go no further. It's blocked by its own friendly piece. You cannot jump over pieces with a rook. Okay, now a rook can also do one more thing. It can capture an enemy piece. So let's put a black piece on the board here. If this rook wants to capture that piece, it can do so. It can move to the left and land on top of the enemy piece and occupy its square and remove that piece from the board. That's how pieces get captured in chess. You land on them and remove them from the board. Okay, let's turn our attention to another piece, the bishop. The bishop looks like this. It's pointy on the top, and a bishop moves in a diagonal, always along a diagonal line, any number of squares. So this bishop can move, for example, up to the right like that, and then maybe it goes up to the left one square, and then maybe down to the left pretty far, and then maybe down to the right a couple squares. So an interesting thing about this bishop is notice it's on a dark colored square right now. Well, throughout the whole game it will remain on a dark colored square because it's always traveling along these diagonals. It will never access those light colored squares. And just like a rook, it can be blocked by its own pieces and it cannot jump over them, and it can capture enemy pieces by landing on them. Okay, so let's turn our attention to the queen. Queen looks like that. It's wearing that spiky crown. Now, a queen combines the powers of a rook and a bishop. So a queen can move horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. And it can also move any number of squares. So this queen can move maybe up to the right to here, and maybe it goes straight down to here, and maybe straight left over to there, and then maybe up to the left here. Maybe it goes right one square, maybe it goes down along that diagonal. So it moves like either a rook or a bishop. So it's a very mobile piece. It can move in a lot of directions, a lot of squares. So for that reason, it's called the most powerful piece on the chessboard. Now, just like a rook or a bishop, it can get blocked by its own friendly pieces, and it can capture enemy pieces by landing on top of them and removing them from the board. Okay, let's turn our attention now to a king. So king looks like that, and it has that little cross on the top. And a king can also move horizontally, vertically, or diagonally, but it's limited to a movement of just one square. It can only take a one square move. So this king can move to any of these squares I am highlighting and only those squares. So it can move right one, then maybe it can go up to the right one, and maybe down one, maybe down left one. That's it. So kings take one square steps, and that's it. And just like the other pieces, their friendly pieces can block them. So that rook is blocking the king from moving up to the left. You cannot land on your own piece. You cannot capture your own piece, but you can capture an enemy piece. So if we had a black rook there, then the king can land on it and remove it from the board. Okay, so let's turn our attention to a very tricky piece, the knight. The knight looks like a horse, but it's not called a horse. It is called a knight. Now, the knight moves in the shape of a capital L, like that. And it's 3 squares along one direction and 2 squares along another direction. That capital L shape. And it moves from one end of the L to the other, like that. Now the L can be rotated, flipped over, it can be oriented any way at all. So there's another capital L, and it can move from one end of that L to the other like that. From one end of an L to another like that. Or like that. Or that. Or that. Now if you're playing actual physical chess with pieces on a board, you don't have to mimic the movement of the L. Just pick up the knight and put it on its destination square directly. So the knights are really tricky to get used to for beginners. Let's try to visualize something. Let's put the knight right there near the center of the board. And I want to ask you a question. Try to visualize all of the squares that knight can go to. In fact, count how many squares that knight can go to. Maybe pause the video and decide how many squares can it go to. Okay, you should have found 8 squares. That knight can travel to this square, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one. Those are the 8 squares it can reach by the shape of an L. Now, there's something special about the movement of a knight. Notice it's on a dark square right now, and look at all of those destination squares I highlighted. They're all light colored squares. Well, that always happens. When a knight moves, it always changes the color of the square it's sitting on. So right now, this knight is on a dark square. It can move to that light square. And the next time it moves, it will end up on a dark square. And then if it moves again, it ends up on a light square, and then a dark square, and so on. There's something else special about the movement of a knight. And I'm going to put the starting position back up here. This is what a game looks like at the beginning. Knights are the only piece that can jump over other pieces. So if you're playing a game of chess and you're white, you're going to be going first. This knight that I'm highlighting right here can move right now. It looks like it's blocked in, but knights can jump. The only requirement is that the square it lands on should be empty unless you're taking an enemy piece. You can land on an enemy piece and take it off the board. So this knight, for example, can move like this, and that could be your first move in your game of chess. Another way that knight could move is like that. Okay. Now, if you want to get the other pieces into the game, then you have to move your pawns out of the way. For example, if you want to get this bishop into the game, then you could take, for example, this pawn right here, move it forward, either 1 or 2 squares, and then you've opened up a diagonal, and the next time you move, you can bring that bishop out along that diagonal. So the pawns are blocking in your pieces until you move them forward, except for the knights. The knights can jump over the pawns. Now, speaking of pawns, pawns are the last piece to talk about. So to talk about how pawns move, I'm going to put all the pawns on their original squares. Oops, I messed that up. Let me try that again. Oops, I'm pretty bad at this. I'm trying to get them all on their original squares. Now, pawns are very limited in their movements. Pawns can only move forward. That means toward the enemy side of the board. So for white, forward means up the board, and for black, forward means down the board. Now, generally, a pawn can only move one square at a time, like that, or like that, or that. It's one square forward. However, there's an exception to that. If a pawn is on its original square, then it can move 2 squares forward. It's a rule that was invented in order to speed up the game. So only when it's on its original square does it have that option. And it can move 1 square if you want to, or it can move 2. But once it has moved, then from that point on, it's only going 1 square forward at a time. Now, there's something else special about pawns. Pawns are the only piece that capture in a different direction than they move. So let me explain. Let's say that white opens the game by moving this pawn forward, and then black takes this pawn and moves it forward, and now it's white's turn. You might guess that this pawn can go forward 1 step and land on the black pawn and capture it, but it cannot. That black pawn is blocking. We say it's blocking the white pawn from moving any further, and the white pawn is blocking the black pawn from moving any further. Pawns do not capture in a direct forward motion. Pawns capture by going 1 square forward diagonally on a diagonal. So this white pawn right here could capture an enemy piece that is either here or here. So for example, if white makes this move and black makes this move, now this pawn can move on a diagonal to capture that pawn. You cannot move on a diagonal unless you are capturing, though. You can go forward 1 square on a diagonal in order to capture. Okay, and then if this black pawn comes forward like that, then white has a choice. He can either push his pawn forward 1 square, or he could capture that black pawn like that. And if black makes another move like this, then you can capture that pawn if you want, and so on. Now, one more thing about pawns. If you get a pawn across the board to the other side, then you cannot make any more forward progress. So you might guess the pawn is stuck there forever. Well, it's not. If you get a pawn to the other side of the board, then that pawn gets a promotion, which means it turns into another piece. And you can choose any piece you want, except it cannot remain a pawn, and it cannot turn into a king. As we will see later, a king is a very special piece in chess, and you can only have 1 at a time. But when you get a pawn across, you can promote it to either a queen, a rook, a bishop, or a knight. And most people will choose a queen most of the time because a queen is the most powerful piece on the board. So the way that works is when you get your pawn across, you then remove the pawn from the board and replace it with the piece you choose. And yes, you can have more than 1 queen on the board at the same time. You can have as many queens as you want until you run out of pawns to promote. Now, if you're playing with an actual physical set, you may not have extra queens handy for that purpose. Well, you can use a quarter or an upside down rook or something to mark your extra queen. Okay, anyway, you do have to promote to one of the pieces, queen, rook, bishop, or knight. All right, so that is how all of the pieces move, and that's how they capture, and that's how they get blocked by their own friendly pieces. We will continue to explore the rules of chess in upcoming videos. Thank you very much for watching this one.